Hello, friends. Welcome back to another episode of I'll Call You Right Back podcast with me, your host. My name is Chad Medved. This is my show, my podcast. Welcome to it. If you're new here, a little breakdown about what I do at I'll Call You Right Back. I talk to interesting figures throughout the community and just kind of figure out what makes them tick. People that I, appreciate, people that I personally, like as far as, business wise, whether they have a restaurant or a brand or they sell some sort of wares. That's how this podcast is created. I find people that interest me and I contact them and I talk to them about their life's work. And I've been working at it for about 6 years now. I'm very proud of what I do here. I'm very thankful for all the support and all the, the listens that, that come in every week. It really gives me a reason to keep this thing going. Aside from talking to all the fascinating people that we have burrowed, hidden into our city. It's pretty incredible that 6 years into it, I still am constantly hearing about new, fascinating, interesting people throughout the city of Pittsburgh. And it just goes to show you, I feel like that I do a good job at, digging through and finding the people to talk to that I need to. Never surprises me that there's always someone that I've never heard about. And, if you like what I do with the podcast, if this is your first week listening, hope you enjoy it. My conversation with David is fantastic, but, beyond my conversation with David, look back at all the other names that I have in my phone book that I've built over the last 6 years. And, if you're interested in the city, this is the place to learn about it. Everyone could have, told you about something from their experience, and everyone could have, mentioned, their opinion on certain brands and businesses. But, the goal of I'll Call You Right Back is to get to the root of it all. I want to talk to the people, not just the people that are patronizing these places, but I want to talk to the people who created the brand. And that's what we do here each and every week. And it's much appreciated that everyone's here listening to it right now. If you want to support a independent guy like myself, there is a couple ways to do it. First and foremost, you could subscribe to the podcast anywhere you're listening to it. You can, rate and review the podcast. That is a huge help for me. If you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, there's a way to give me, a rating of 5 stars. If you want to do that and you want to offer me a couple of nice words about what you enjoy about the podcast, that is such a big help for me, and it's so thankful, and it costs nothing to you. But if you want to support monetarily, there's also ways to do that as well. And any money that is invested into I'll Call You Right Back gets reinvested by me into making this show something even better than it is now. But there's a Patreon that I have. If you just want to show your support, you can subscribe to the Patreon. $5 every week, or every month rather. Sorry, $5 every month comes out of your account, goes into mine. That's just a tip of the hat to thank me for putting out some free content each week. And if you want to do something where you want to get a hard good from me, go to I'llCallYouRightBack.com. I have some merchandise. You could buy some t-shirts, and that is, that's the best way to support me. I don't have any upcoming events yet. I'm working on something for the winter time. Might not be exactly Christmas themed, but it's going to be winter time. Very excited about that. I'm thinking about doing a little movie screening and live podcast after. I'm not sure exactly yet, but if that's something that piques your interest, slide into the DMs and let me know that is something that you would want to go to. I've done that the last couple years that I've done the podcast, and it's always been a success. So I figured why not try to throw something else together little movie premiere, little slice of pizza, and a little live podcast talking about the movie. I think we can make it a fun event, but I will keep you up to date on that. You can always follow me at I'll Call You Right Back. That is the best way to stay up to date on everything that I got going on in my life and everything that is happening with the podcast. But enough about me. I beat your ear long enough about my riot act. But the reason everyone is here this week I sit down with a fellow named David Rullo. David Rullo is a father. He is a writer. He is a cool guy. I just came across David 2 weeks ago. We were able to turn this around and make this happen pretty quickly. But I think as my interests as a reader has grown in the past few months, I was trying to research local authors to, sit down and interview. I'm kind of fascinated about books right now, so I wanted to talk to people about how they wrote a book. I've been crazily, I would love to write a book in my lifetime. That's neither here nor there, but I came across David's book, which is called Gen X Pittsburgh, the Beehive and the 90's Scene. And basically what this is, I'm going to read you the back of the book, and that's the best way to break down what Gen X Pittsburgh, the Beehive, and the 90's Scene is. A caffeinated look back. In Pittsburgh in the early 1990s, artists began to rent empty apartments. What were once shot in a beer bars became hip dives, and entrepreneurs found inexpensive real estate to follow their visions. The Beehive on East Carson Street was a revolutionary coffee house, attracting pioneering artists, musicians, employees, freaks, geeks, movie lovers, and more. Visionary owners Scott Kramer and Steve Zumhoff built an iconic touchstone of Pittsburgh's Gen X culture as the city began to recover from a post-industrial stagnation. The Beehive was part of a burgeoning scene that also including establishments such as Dee's Cafe, The Culture Shop, Club Laga, and the Lava Lounge. Through extensive interviews, author David Rullo recalls cappuccinos, thrift shop culture, grunge music, local alternative bands, and the hangout at the center of it all in 1990s Pittsburgh. Now, Gen X Pittsburgh, the Beehive and the 90's Scene is available everywhere. We have a lot of local local bookstores in the city. I'm sure you have a preferred one. If you are a reader, you could get a copy of this book. David is more than willing to sign it for you if you would like. Reach out to him, David Rullo. You could find him on Facebook. He said he's on Instagram. That's the best way. But you could call one of these bookstores, and if they don't got it, ask them if they got it. If they don't got it in there, tell them you want it in there. Order it through them. It's going to help this guy out. He's a local artist, local writer, and it's a fascinating conversation. Personally, I'm 33. The Beehive closed in 2000, and I think they said that the Beehive closed in 2019. My last time at the Beehive was probably, 2013 maybe. But whenever I was like 17, 18, 19, I spent a lot of time down there. We would ride the bus down to Pittsburgh. We would get rides down to Pittsburgh. We would, find some way to get down to Pittsburgh, and we would go hang out at the Beehive. And that's where I smoked my first cigarette. That's where I spent, my first night out on the town, basically. The Beehive was just like, the place to be. And I am of a different generation than David, so it being a place that meant a lot to me, it's fascinating to sit down with someone who lived in its heyday, so to speak. It's fascinating to hear about how much it meant to them, people that were in that generation whenever it first started back in the early 90s. It's cool to hear these stories, and it's cool to hear about why it made such an impact on its life, and why it made such an impact on Pittsburgh, and ultimately why it kind of broke some barriers as a place for people to go to feel included if they were, weirdos. You know, we're all weirdos. We all want to be included places. The Beehive was a place that accepted everyone, whether your skin color, whether your sexual orientation, whether anything like that. Basically, you just had to not be a piece of shit. He talks about a story about how a Nazi pulled up there one day and they basically shunned him, told him to get the fuck out of there. And, you know, he got a lot of cool stories, and it's a great conversation. So I'll leave it at that. Grab David's book. You could find it anywhere. If you're not in Pittsburgh, you can grab it off Amazon. But like I said, hit up local bookstores, you know, help these people out. Grab Gen X Pittsburgh, the Beehive in the 90s scene, and learn a little bit more about the Southside of Pittsburgh and the legend behind the Beehive. Without further ado, episode 262 of I'll Call You Right Back podcast with author David Rullo.
Telephone.
Hello?
Telephone.
I'll call you right back. Call you right back.
Telephone.
I'll Call You Right Back podcast. Yeah, the podcast, I don't know, I started this like 6 years ago, and this is like, this was the first time I ever went down there and ended up winning something. Yeah. So I was, you know, it's cool to do.
Yeah.
I see that in the past you have, you've gotten nominated for Best Writer.
One time, yeah.
Now,
2 years ago.
I mean, I have to be full disclosure. I know nothing about you.
That's okay.
I came across this book. I don't even remember how I came across it, where this whole project, you know, I don't know how it came in front of me, but I'm glad that we're happening. Yeah, I'm glad it's happening right now.
Yeah, glad to be here.
Gen X Pittsburgh, the Beehive in the 90s scene. So this is a book that you just published, or you just put out.
Yeah, a week ago.
A week ago today.
Yeah, published by Arcadia Publishing.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
So, I mean, like I said, I don't know much about you, so let's start from the beginning. Are you from Pittsburgh?
I am. I grew up in North Versailles, so outside of Pittsburgh.
We're at North Versailles. I grew up in McKeesport.
Oh, okay.
I grew up in Haler Heights, and then right by Sarah High School.
Yeah.
My parents both went to McKeesport High School.
Okay.
So I'm familiar with that area.
So I grew up on Mary Ellen Drive.
Okay.
And so that is back by, if you know where. If you are coming up Foster Road, like from White Oak into, you're going to go to 48.
Yeah.
Off of there is Mary Ellen Drive.
Okay, yeah.
And so I spent the first 8 years of my life there, and then we moved. No, I'm sorry. I moved there. I was there until I was probably 12 or 13. We moved to Connecticut for like
you moved to Connecticut after that?
Yeah, for 4 or 5 years. Mm-hmm. 4 or 5 years, I put a 6 up. And then we moved back, and I lived in Wall. So if you know where Wall is.
No.
Wall is right next to Wilmerding.
Oh, okay. I know where Wilmerding is.
So
Station Break Cafe.
That's right. I grew up, I lived that second part for, it was like 10 minutes from the Station Break Cafe.
Okay. Is that place still around?
I think it is.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's where I got my grad party chicken.
Okay. Yeah.
I think that's where my brother did. A lot of people did.
That makes a lot of sense.
I always, that place will always stay in my mind because it always, I'm 34. So growing up, I would always see that sign, and I would always like tell my parents and be like, "We're going to Hollywood." But yeah, I know Wilmerding. I'm familiar with that. That's cool though. So you after living in, you said you moved to Connecticut,
right?
And where do you go after that?
After moving back to Wall, you mean?
Yeah, you moved back to Wall right after that.
Yeah, right.
And you stayed there from ever since?
No. So that's where my family moved.
Okay.
These were family moves. So my family moved from North Versailles to Connecticut, and then back to Pennsylvania. We moved because my mother had got transferred.
Okay.
And then we came back because we wanted to be back in Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
So I went to college at Point Park.
Yeah.
Back when it was a college.
Yeah.
And then I lived downtown. Well, I lived at the college, and then in Mount Washington.
So always around Pittsburgh.
Always around Pittsburgh. Yeah.
What I mean, what's your what do you do for work? Like, are you a writer full time?
I am. I worked for. So I went to school for journalism.
Yeah.
And I worked at KQV as the production director. So that was the all news radio station in the city.
All News is that still around?
KQV it's no longer an all news radio station. And it's no longer a downtown Pittsburgh station. It's now like an easy listening station or something. It's owned by, I think, somebody in White Oak or something like that.
Oh, okay.
But it was the very first radio station in the country. KDKA gets all the press because KDKA was the first commercial radio station.
Yeah.
KQV was the first radio station that transmitted out to sea.
Really?
And so, and they have a long history. They were one of the first rock stations in the city. They brought the Beatles in.
Wow.
They were they started
KQV.
1410 AM.
I got to check that out. I don't know too much about it. That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, like, where does the interest of all this stuff come into
so,
play? Like, whenever you were younger, like, what were you interested in? Were you always into writing?
Yeah. I was a weird kid.
Aren't we all?
Yeah.
I feel like anyone that I talk to is generally a weird kid.
Right. I grew up really interested in writing. You know, in sixth grade, I can remember sitting on my porch and reading 1984 by George Orwell, the 1984 version of 1984 by George Orwell. And it just went from there. By the time I moved to Connecticut, I started getting into rock music. And so I started reading like about Jim Morrison and finding out that he was into the Doors and things like, he was into Jack Kerouac and things like that. So I started getting into beat literature pretty heavily. I have
as an influence from like your favorite rockers.
Yes.
You know, it's like, I love the Doors. So like, you know, I'm going to like Jack Kerouac.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. I mean, that's understandable. It's interesting. So you always were a reader.
Yes.
You always gravitated towards that. I'm like having an epiphany in my, mid 30s. I never read. All right. Never read. I would spark notes, the projects and books, but since June, I went on a work trip. I bought a book and I haven't stopped yet.
Yeah.
I'm like about to be at book 15 in a couple months, but I just have becoming, I've becoming so in love with it. And I don't know why I just never enjoyed it before. Maybe I was just too young to, my focus wasn't there. But now that you say that, I think that's how I came familiar with your book, because I was looking up, random local authors, things like that, and I think it came up in that way, just because of the the recent interest that I've had in it.
Yeah, sure.
But that's interesting. Like your favorite artists and like what they like, it kind of becomes what you like.
That's right. And to push things along further, when I was in so by the time I'm in high school, I started getting into alternative music and sort of, it was still kind of the early days, but the early days of industrial music and things like that. And so I was walking around this suburb in Western Pennsylvania with a skater haircut and a 3/4 length leather jacket and like didn't fit in there at all. Not at all, And so, when I got to the city at Point Park was a very, very, very different college.
Yeah.
In 1990, it was like a big like high school or art school.
Yeah.
And so, and that's what I needed. I was definitely not ready for like a university where you were left to your own devices. I was a pretty big screw up probably, and was able to sort of find my way at Point Park. And so I worked in radio for a long time. It wasn't just KQV. I worked at KDKA. I worked at 104.7 when it was the Revolution.
Did you go for broadcasting at Point Park?
This is a funny story if you want to hear it. So I decided I was going to go to Point Park to be a writer.
Okay, that was what you were thinking of in high school, like as a career. I wanted to be a writer.
Yes.
Okay.
And I thought, Hemingway was like a journalist. All these other people were journalists, so I'll go to school to be a journalist.
Yeah.
And I found out pretty quickly that the journalism is a form of writing, but it's more about like making sure that you cite your sources on the second time by their last name and all this other AP style, right? And so I went to my advisor, my faculty advisor, and I said, this doesn't seem right to me. I don't think I'm going to fit in here. And he said, well, what do you think you're going to do, Rullo? And I said, I think I'll be a writer. And he said, yep, you and everybody else.
Yeah.
So when you're not writing the great American novel, what are you going to do to pay the bills?
Okay.
And I said, I probably teach English. And he said, okay, I'm going to say some names to you. And he named a few of the English professors at Point Park. And he was like, what do they have in common? I said, I get it. They all have doctor in front of their name. And he said, that's right. You're not getting your doctorate. Go back to class. And so I said to myself, if I'm going to stay in journalism, where can I have the absolute most fun? And radio was it. You know, it was much less serious than print journalism was. So I buckled down and took radio pretty seriously. You know, like I said, I worked at most of the stations. So did pretty.
How'd you get in? You know, like how do you get your foot in the door?
Yeah. So I was the program director, the general manager, the production director of my college radio station.
Yeah.
And then I started interning. I interned at 104.7. I interned at the 107.9 WDSY. And then KQV, I was still in college and KQV was looking for a production director. And that was my foot in the door.
Oh, okay.
It was still all analog equipment. So it was, cutting tape with razor blades. And,
wow.
And
what year is this?
That was 96.
Okay.
I started college in 90, but I was paying for myself. So I was not the quickest.
Slow and steady.
That's right.
What was your interest as far as like, radio? Like you said, journalism, whenever you wanted to get involved with the radio, in what way? Were you looking to be just like, you don't sound like you just wanted to be a disc jockey.
I had no interest at all. With a voice like this, you don't go to school to be a disc jockey, right? Like I don't have that classic radio voice. I really like production, and what I was doing at the time was experimenting with writing as well. So first of all, I'll tell you, I continued to do freelance writing for the entire time I was in college. The entire time I was in radio, I was always doing freelance writing as well.
For what type of stuff? Newspapers, magazines, stuff like that?
In literary magazines, I was I did a lot of writing for the Shadyside Jazz Festival when it was around.
Okay.
There was a place called Distinction Magazine I wrote for. I wrote for Gen X Pittsburgh. I wrote for
pretty much whatever.
Yeah, whoever was going to pay me. But the literary stuff I took more seriously. And so during this time, as I'm interested in industrial music and all of that, I was experimenting with taking writing and cutting it up and using tapes to manipulate it and adding sound effects and music. Yeah. And so I created, a buddy of mine and me created a band called Digital Buddha. And so it was really sound that I was interested in, not necessarily radio. Yeah. And how to manipulate that and
just
how to
the whole art of it all.
Yeah, exactly. And so the second Art All Night at Lawrenceville we played, where it was just like he was playing guitar, I was triggering samples and like reading bad poetry, but there were like 600 people on literally on Butler Street that hung out and just watched this.
This like experimental type of project.
Yeah.
Digital Buddha.
Yeah, Digital Buddha. And then that morphed into an
Art All Night's been going on that long?
Oh, a long time.
Man, I got to talk to whoever is responsible for that, because I've never been there, but like every year I see it and it's like, it's like it passes me right by. I didn't even know it was happening. Yeah. But I'm actually working with Lawrenceville now, so I'm gonna figure out who's behind all that.
Yeah, I don't even know who.
That's interesting that you guys were doing that back then. So you were, as your friend was like playing instruments, you had like things that you wrote that you were. Was it like spoken word type stuff almost?
It was. It quickly changed after that to a more industrial type of band, so sort of like Skinny Puppy or Nine Inch Nails, with sort of like progressive rock, King Crimson sort of guitar over it. It was very weird.
Okay, yeah.
And then we became an ambient project called Architects of the Atmosphere.
I like that.
Yeah, that was pretty cool. It was a lot like, I don't know if you're familiar with any like krautrock bands, but it became like Tangerine Dream, sort of early Tangerine Dream. So really experimental electronic music.
What is your, what are you speaking about back then? Like what was getting you fired up? Were you like a political guy? Were you like in it like that? Were you in it to like,
I guess there was some political overtone to it, but it was also more kind of about society, like at whole, like.
Well, I feel like back in the 90s, like if you weren't part of like, one side of it all, you were more like, trying to, highlight what's going on in the world in your own way as, as an artist that you are.
That's right. It was, looking back on it, it was all pretty bad, but
we're all like, I was a jackass whenever I was 20, 21, like whole different lifetime.
Right.
But it's interesting to think that like back then you're so passionate in your, in what you're doing in your craft that you're like performing in front of all these people. That's why I was curious, like what type of things, like what was your message back then?
Yeah.
But that's cool. That's cool to hear about.
Yeah.
So you were always involved with this band. You were involved with this band for years while you're writing freelance while you're pursuing, radio.
Because I had to be.
Yeah.
We had a record label from out of England called Synthetic Records that basically paid for CDs to be made. I mean, it was, CDs back then. But that's all we got out of it. So, other than gigs on the weekends, and it might surprise you to hear that in Western Pennsylvania, experimental electronic music doesn't go over.
It didn't pop off. Didn't pop off.
We played a
what venues?
We played a gig in Penn Hills. So we had a regular gig. I'll tell you, every Tuesday we were the house band. For whatever reason, there was a club in Lawrenceville called Cool Pepper's Hot House.
Cool Pepper's Hot House.
And they took a chance and did an electronic night, like I think it was Tuesdays, every Tuesday. We were the house band. And so we played there. We played this place in Penn Hills. I remember, a woman comes up to us and she sees us setting up all these synthesizers and stuff and computers. And she's like, well, what kind of music is this? And so I start broad, right? And I'm like, well, so you've heard of Pink Floyd, right? And she's like, yeah. And I'm like, okay, so have you heard of like Can or Tangerine Dream? She's like, no. And I said, okay, well, it's sort of like Pink Floyd, but, not really. So we play a song. And she comes immediately. She comes up to us and she's like, "So, can you maybe just play Pink Floyd?" And I was like, "Well, if Pink Floyd was here, would you ask him to play Digital Buddha?" And she said, "Absolutely not." And I said, "Right, so we're not going to play Pink Floyd."
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but we played. What was the place? We played Nick's Fat City. We used to go to Cleveland and play all the time. We were fairly successful in terms of the clubs we played.
That's cool. How many years did this last?
Lasted a long time. Probably 4 or 5 as Digital Buddha, but then another 4 or 5 as Architects of the Atmosphere. Yeah.
Wow, that's pretty awesome. And all while you're, writing, pretty regularly? I
wrote nonstop. Yeah.
Wow.
I mean, that was my real passion. But I was working in radio. And in fact, at one point, my wife and I decided we were going to get married. And so I was the production director at KQV. And at the time, I think I was making $5.75 an hour.
Yeah.
And so I went to the general manager. It's the oldest radio station in the country. I'm making $5.75 an hour as a production director. And I got really ticked off because I found out my buddy who was the production director at WTAE was making something like $19,000 a year. And I was like, this is outrageous. This has to stop. And so I went and I said, I need a raise. And he said, I could get a monkey to do your job. If you want to raise, move into sales. And so that's what I did for a few years. I was horrible at it. I hated sales. Sales did not like me. It didn't fit into my lifestyle. I'd play a gig on the weekend and my wife would be like, we should bleach your hair and then dye the tips black. And and I'd show up for a sales job in radio at this conservative radio station and they were like,
it's not working.
That's not going to work. And so the lifestyle just didn't work out right for that. And then I went to work for, believe it or not, the largest book, movie, and music distribution company in the area. So we sold CDs, DVDs, and books to stores, and the internet was just sort of catching fire. So,
what year is this, and where is this place called?
Yeah, it was called Baker and Taylor, and this was probably, I don't know, maybe early 2000s. Probably the early 2000s. And I did that for a few years. I moved up. I became a very long title, which was music merchandising manager / grocery, which meant that there were a chain of stores in Texas called HEBs that were opening up record stores inside of their stores. And they were huge because it was Texas and everything's big there. So they were, they would have a couple thousand titles in their store. And I was the guy that picked out every title that was in the store.
That's pretty cool.
It is. I did, I would set up in-store signings with bands. Now it was a lot of like regional Mexican music but it was also Night Ranger and some other things like that.
That's cool that you were involved in. Still finding a way to be involved with music and in that scene.
I stupidly thought this would get me one step closer because I would be talking to the labels themselves.
Yeah.
And so while I was talking to the labels, I thought I would just slip them a CD and then they would sign me. And what I didn't know was they had their own sales staff that doesn't interact with like the A&R side at all.
Yeah.
So
didn't work.
It did not work.
Well, I'm curious to know, you said in this whole time of you pursuing this, you'd never stopped writing. You said that was your real passion. This sounds like your passion, but you said that writing was your real passion. In this time that you're writing, are you writing just for work or are you writing for pleasure?
No, I was writing for pleasure. I have a book of poetry that was self-published called Tired Scenes from a City Window. There was a lot of writing from college in this period. I was writing short stories. I was writing a bunch of poetry that got published in different literary magazines. In fact, I kind of... I don't want to say I fell backwards into journalism because I didn't, because I always wanted to be a writer. And so I'm missing, I think, a pretty important part of the story for you, which is that many years ago, my son, who is now 18, started to ask questions when people around us were dying. Mm-hmm. And so there were these big questions, and my wife and I were raising him as an atheist. And I said to Kim, I think we're doing Jack a disservice. You
were both atheists?
I mean, I mean, I'm not sure that's what we were, but that's a pretty good working title for what we were. Yeah. Right?
To sum it up.
Yes. Yeah. We certainly weren't Christian, Okay, I had been to, looked into some Buddhism and was doing some of that kind of stuff, but nothing formalized.
It's so fascinating, this whole topic of, because I don't know, I was raised as a Catholic, and as a child, you are, kind of led to certain things, and it's not your choice. But as an adult, you come into your own choices and your own beliefs, and ultimately how you want to live your life. And me and my wife don't have kids. We don't plan on having kids, but that's always such an interesting thing to me because I know so many people that are my peers that are the same way, went to Sunday school and then fell away from organized religion because you got to call it as it is. It's kind of fucked up. Yeah. And people understand that, but as a kid, or as an adult having a kid, how would you want to incorporate that into their lives? And that's such an interesting thing. And that's something that I always think about because I don't necessarily think me being raised as a Catholic did me a disservice. I liked having that experience of learning what it was and having the ability to know about that to make my own choices anyway.
Sure.
But it's interesting that you were saying that. So how did you end up pursuing that?
So my wife, you mentioned Sarah. My wife grew up Catholic as well. Went to Sarah High School. Went to did the whole boat of religion.
Yeah.
And so Jack came, asked these questions. I said to Kim, I think we're doing him a disservice. He knows what we don't believe in, but he doesn't know anything that we do believe in.
Yeah.
So we should probably try to figure that out. And we started going to, there's a temple, a Jewish temple in my neighborhood, and they had like an introduction to Judaism course thing that I went to. And I was like, yeah, this is it. This is where I think I fit. Right. And so, I converted to Judaism. I, was the vice president of our temple. I worked for an organization called South Hills Jewish Pittsburgh. And so while I was working for South Hills Jewish Pittsburgh, I was freelance writing for the Pittsburgh Jewish Chronicle.
Oh, okay.
And South Hills Jewish Pittsburgh, the Chronicle came to me and said, hey, would you like to work for us full time?
Yeah.
And so I started there full time like 5 years ago. And now I am a senior, there's two of us, two senior staff writers. So I'm a senior staff writer with the Pittsburgh Jewish Chronicle. And that's what actually led to the book being published. Because, and we haven't even, I'll talk to you about the Beehive and stuff in a minute if you want.
Yeah. We're absolutely going to get into that.
Yeah.
But I want to know, obviously this is what we're focusing on, but I want to know kind of a little bit about your backstory. It's fascinating.
So the only reason I was able to get this book published is because I won, a fair amount of national and local journalism awards because of the Chronicle.
Yeah.
But not for that. No one would have talked to me. And I know that because I used to call publishers and say, hey, I have this fabulous idea for a book. And they would say, yeah, you and everyone else, and never return my phone calls. But with this book, I was able to call and say, hey, I'm an award-winning journalist. And they were like, oh yeah, we'll sit down and listen to you.
Yeah.
So that's what actually allowed me to publish this book.
Ah.
If I hadn't won those awards, if I hadn't become a writer with the Pittsburgh Jewish Chronicle,
you wouldn't have that credibility.
This doesn't happen. Yeah. And it also, Scott and Steve, the two guys that owned the Beehive, are Jewish. So they read they read me in the Chronicle every week. And that lent credibility to them as well, to be able to say, I can do this. Right.
Yeah.
And so they were interested in it because of that.
Wow. That's a wild, turn of events, or a wild chain of events rather.
My life almost sounds like, if you didn't know me, you would think I had a very successful and very fascinating life, right? It's only when you know me that you find out it hasn't been that.
Well, it's so interesting. You're going to be episode 262. So I've had an opportunity to talk to so many different people, and it's so, and that's ultimately why I started this. It's because we all know, the reason, these brands that everyone loves, the books that everyone loves, but I want to know how you got there.
Yeah.
And this is my excuse and my, made up way to be able to ask people over. And, Sally Wiggin, if I saw her in a grocery store, I couldn't just berate her with questions.
Right.
But if I ask her to come over here, she knows that I'm going to berate her with questions, and she's more prepared for it.
That's right.
So I created my own world.
Yeah.
But that's so cool that it kind of all interweaves together. And, I don't know. We talk about you mentioned under an umbrella term of atheism, and in my later years I struggle with what it is, but I always find myself believing in not necessarily divine intervention, but things happen for a reason. But I don't know, it's so interesting to believe that, but not some of the things with, I don't know, it's a funny topic.
Right.
What where do you tie into the 90s scene and Southside and everything like that? How are you always around there?
Well, no. So when I started Point Park in 1990, downtown was a ghost town.
Yeah. In downtown?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Because the steel mills had collapsed.
Yeah.
Right. So downtown it had things there during the workday. You know what I mean? People were there during the workday, but there wasn't anything at night. There wasn't anything, certainly for a 18 to 22-year-old college kid to do. Right?
Yeah, a misunderstood college kid.
That's right. Next to Point Park, there was a Rax. If you remember Rax, it was sort of like Arby's.
Okay.
Yeah. It was on Boulevard of the Allies. But that was almost it. Even there was Ide's record store, but I think they closed at probably 6 or 7, right? There was nowhere. There weren't any clubs. What
was Point Park like? Obviously now it has the reputation it has of being the fancy art school and everything. Was it as illustrious as it sounds now?
No, so it was an art school.
Yeah.
That's what it felt like. I went to school for journalism, but every one of my friends who were going to school for journalism were in rock bands or doing films. And, it was sort of like journalism was a gateway in Point Park to really explore different artistic fields. Photography, which was still labs, back then. Mm-hmm. And there were dancers and there were actors, but that was it. There weren't a whole lot of, you weren't going to go in there and find like somebody who was studying law. It felt like Fame, even though I'm not, the movie Fame. I probably romanticized it in my head, but it was 3 buildings at the time. I mean, the school always seemed one step ahead of being shut down because they didn't have any money. It was a completely different scene. But on the other hand, the journalism department was like really well regarded. Yeah. And so you asked me, how did I get those jobs? If I hadn't gone to Point Park, I would never have gotten the internships that I got that gave me the opportunities to work in radio. Yeah. And so that's literally what did it. But it was, it was a fun school, but it wasn't.
How many years? 4 years you went?
I went 6.
6. Oh yeah. You said you took your time.
Yeah. Often people go 4.
Well, in them 6 years that you're down there and there's not really anything in the, direct city, I assume that you probably venture out to places like the Southside, right? And, so, North Side, things like that.
Right. So that's what happened was I started school in September of 90 and the Beehive opened in February of 91. Yeah. So we were going to the South Side. We were going a few other places.
What was even down there before, because it's interesting because obviously now the South Side holds its a certain regard. People know what it's about now. But back then it's, I can't even imagine what it was like before that. Was there a lot of like places before that?
No, back then. So through the mid-80s, from the collapse of the steel mills in the 70s through the late 80s into the early 90s, the South Side was a neighborhood that was supporting the people that lived there.
Was Jack's open?
Jack's was, it must have been because Jack's was there when the Beehive was there.
Oh, okay.
And Dee's was open, but Dee's was a completely different kind of bar. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Dee's.
Yeah, I'm familiar now. It's a pool bar.
Yeah, but back then, it was like a shot and a beer kind of bar for like mill workers. Yeah. Right? There was even a salad bar at one point there because people would come off their shift and go and eat, right? And so the South Side supported its community, but it wasn't trying to pull people in from the outside.
Yeah.
And because of that, because there were a bunch of like rundown old buildings and old steel mills, rents were cheap. So artists could live there, and people who had ideas like about coffee houses or like Slacker, which was, this really alternative.
It's still there, right?
Yeah, but it's a little different now.
It's always been that same guy.
No, it was a guy named Randy back then. He sold it to, I can't remember if it was his brother-in-law or somebody else, but he sold it. He got busted. I don't know if you remember, but in the late 90s, Tommy Cheech got busted. He was making pipes. So this was pre sort of medical marijuana and all of that. And he had pipes that he had been selling, distributing anyways. And Randy and Slacker and a few like Teleropa, a few other places were selling these pipes.
Oh my God. Yeah. I remember Teleropa.
Yeah. And they were all busted.
Wow.
And so when he was busted,
you weren't allowed to sell pipes?
No, it was drug paraphernalia.
Oh, I guess so.
Yeah. So,
interesting.
Yeah. So he got busted. I mean, Tommy Chong got busted as part of this bust.
Yeah. Right? Oh, you said, okay. Yeah.
Okay. So Tommy Chong and Randy sold the place because you've been busted. And You had to pay for lawyers and everything else.
So you had these like random places, but like, what were like, was there a bunch of restaurants in Southside? Was there like venues?
No. So Nick's Fat City was there shortly after. All of it started to develop at once, right? Yeah. Like the Beehive, I think of it as almost like a gateway drug, right? It was the first sort of really
cool place,
and then everything started to come in.
What comes first, the Beehive in the South Side or the one in the city?
Yeah, so it was what happened was they opened the Beehive in the South Side on East Carson Street. it was packed every night. They were open 24 hours on the weekend. There were so many people.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, and Scott said, I looked at all these people and I thought, we need to open another one of these. And so he found King's Court in Oakland. They got that place. He said the idea was you open a place 5 times as big and you make 5 times the money. And that was not the case at all, right? In fact,
I saw it said it had like a movie theater there.
It did.
That was obviously before my time to go down there. I went to the Beehive in the Southside. Like that was a staple of my high school, my high school life. But I can't even imagine what it was like when it started. I'm talking about like 2005, 2006, 2007 is whenever I was there.
Right. And I think of the sort of the sweet years of the Beehive were from 91 to like 96, 97, maybe 98. Right?
And kids like me ruined it.
Well, I think that and I talk about that generation too. I mean, those people all have their specific memories of the Beehive, right?
Yeah.
But from 91 to 96 or 97, it was like the tastemaker place, right? Like when the Red Hot Chili Peppers came to town, they went to the Beehive to hang out.
Oh, really?
Cusack came to hang out there, right? Like this is where people who were coming into town that were like artistic and influential.
And this was like something that was like worthy of being passed around by word of mouth.
That's right.
Wow.
That's right.
Like if you knew about it, if you know.
That's right. And it even says in the book that the Red Hot Chili Peppers showed up and, they're just sitting back and having a good time. And it was only when somebody walked up to them and was like, hey, aren't you guys? And they're like, gotta go. And they stood up because that's what they wanted. Sort of that, being able to blend into the crowd at the time.
Yeah. That's so interesting. Wow. I got to talk to those guys about that because, I don't know either of them, but I've spent time there. I've spent many numerous nights. You say the Beehive, I smell clove cigarettes immediately.
Right.
And I even went there. I didn't even like coffee back then, just like struggling through it to kind of fit in. But that's so interesting to think that was like the first place that kind of like started to bring it in. So like, what would you say, like it started to take off in 91, Southside in general?
Well, yeah. When the Beehive opened, a couple of things happened. So first of all, when they were opening, Scott put a sign outside. They had sort of redone the inside, the construction that needed to be done and things like that. And he just put up a sign that said artists wanted to paint the inside. And like a line formed outside the door or the next day of artists who wanted to come in and paint.
Because you said that like Southside really like brought in artistic type of people because it was cheaper, lower end. Wow.
That's right. And so they paid everybody, even the guys that did the logo and the signage and everything. They paid them all with free coffee. They gave them tokens for free coffee. And so it really helped develop this scene of people who were going there not just looking for a place, but it became like their place, right? Because they painted the inside of it.
Yeah.
They were part of this scene. And so as it developed, Slacker opened 6 months later. Groovy opened across the street. Development started happening down the street. The Rex, was playing.
Was the Rex open back then?
No, I think it opened shortly after. It had been something else. Okay. I can't remember what it had been.
Was it like a venue?
I think so.
Oh, okay.
But Nick's Fat City was across the street.
Where was that at?
It was
where Nakama was.
I'm not sure if that.
Because Nakama is across from the Rex.
It might be. It looks like a club. It's got.
Oh, it's where like probably Diesel and.
That's right.
Okay,
yes,
yeah,
it's where Diesel was. Yes. Okay. But at the time, it was the venue where all these bands from the South Side were playing. So the Nixon Clocks and even the Clarks and the Gathering Field and all these other sort
These
of
are all local bands?
Yeah. They were playing there.
Like, was it all the same type of music? Because you just said the Clarks. I don't know the other two people.
Yeah.
So, I mean, like, I envision, a bunch of like punks playing and things like that. Or was it all like kind of welcoming overall?
Yeah. So there were a couple of different scenes in the South Side. At the Beehive themselves, they had some shows downstairs that were more what you would consider straight ahead punk.
Yeah.
Right? But the South Side itself, at the time, Rusted Root had just formed and were starting to get off the ground. In fact, they used to use the Beehive as a meeting place.
Really?
And they even played a bunch of shows in Oakland.
Yeah.
Some of them legendary.
Yeah.
And so the Southside music scene was a little different than the grunge music that was popular at the time.
Yeah.
Like some of the punk. It was really, it was more neo hippie, kind of lighter. I mean, what we think of as coffee house music.
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But no one had really
Developed that term yet.
Right. Right.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah,
You're living it.
That's right. And, the other thing about the Beehive.
How old are you, real quick? I'm sorry.
Oh yeah, I'm 51.
Okay,
So,
I mean, I couldn't put a place on it.
that's great to hear.
But that it kind of puts in perspective of when that that genre kind of was getting hammered out.
Right. Yes. So the music that was down there was more akin to the Replacements, but even that maybe might be a little more punk than some of the bands that were down there.
How did you end up learning about the Beehive? Like you saw it opening?
I think we just showed up in the Southside and
Okay,
we were
yeah.
like, hey, there's a coffee house. And then we went inside.
And then you just
And-
never left.
Yeah. I mean, so if we look, if in our hometowns of, I was in North Sales, my buddy was in Beachview, another friend of mine was from Fox Chapel. But so if we are in our individual hometowns and we look like weirdos, right? And then you walk into the Beehive and
Just
everybody else.
another drop
looked
in the
like us.
bucket.
That's exactly right. And
That was always the best part because like even in my formative years of like becoming who I was, obviously you grow up with the people you grow up with and you take what's the word? Inspiration from what your friends have. But like
Right.
you go to the places like the Beehive and it's a melting pot of all these people and you develop your own stuff. And that was like the first place I saw people painting their fingernails
Right.
and like big ass mohawks that people probably dyed with Kool-Aid.
That's right.
Just cool shit like that. And it was like, whenever you went down there, you felt like you were just like, I don't know. I felt like I didn't feel like a kid,
Right.
Because we were 16 still smoking cigarettes with everyone. But it's like, it was almost like, don't ask, don't tell, just
Right.
part of a good, I don't know, it was a good vibe down there. I never felt weird. I was thinking that as you were coming over, because I was 16, 17, we're hitching rides down there. And it's like, I never felt, unwelcome. It always was like the opposite of that. It was like, come on in and, have a good time. We were like the weird scene kids, I had a swooped hair and,
Yep.
weird shit like that. But it's cool to hear from the other end of it from someone, different generation of it and how that kind of, stuck with them growing up.
Yeah.
That's cool.
There's a quote in the book that, that the Southside, when the Beehive opened, the Southside was, filled with like seniors. Right. And so the guy says, the blue haired ladies didn't like the pink haired ladies that were moving into town. Right. But that tension went away when they realized that most of the people that were hanging out at the Beehive and some of these other places looked weird, but really were respectful of the neighborhood and of the community, right? And there was even a sort of divide. So if you're going to say the Beehive was one tent pole in the Southside, Mario's was like the other tent pole.
That's always been around?
Well, I think it opened maybe a few years before. I don't know because
yeah.
that's not a place I hung out.
It kind of just like me thinking it, I think almost like the Greasers and the Socias.
And so that's exactly what I was going to say. Mario's was much more of like the jocks.
Probably been there
right?
twice in my life.
I don't think I've ever been there, right? But it had more of a frat boy,
Yeah.
and it's almost more responsible for what the Southside is now,
Yeah.
than the Beehive was.
Yeah.
The Beehive was community driven. There's nothing wrong with what Mario's does. They found a way to make it work, and
Absolutely.
and they have certainly built a community around it, right? Like, I mean, all these clubs now certainly are more in that vein, but
100%.
yeah, so you can't build probably, you can't build a whole bunch of clubs out of a bunch of freaks and weirdos, right? Because they're going to find the one place they go to and they're
all
gonna hang
huddle
out
in there.
That's right. And the other thing about the Beehive was it had this allure because it was the first coffee house, at least in the 90s.
Yeah.
There had been some in the 60s and 70s, but like no one had cappuccinos or espressos, right? There were no Starbucks. So Scott and Steve borrowed Starbucks menu when they were on a cross-country trip. And those were the drinks they made. And so, it was like this weird coffee, like you said, the smoke. Boy, I'll never forget the smoke of walking into that place and there's just being a cloud that sat above
mixed in with the grounds and the baked goods if it were there, and like all the different cigarettes people smoke.
That's right.
But no matter what, I swear, a clove cigarette cut through everything.
Yeah, that's right. And the other thing that was really big there was pinball.
Oh yeah, see, I remember reading somewhere that Southside and the culture of pinball, and I believe maybe what was the place that was on the back streets that had all the pinball machines? I think they closed down. It was like an arcade place almost, but that was like a big thing, pinball.
So Steve, the other owner, I don't want to. This is going to sound like I'm being facetious and too hyperbolic probably, but Steve maybe saved pinball in the United States. Steve really liked pinball, and so he brought in machines to the Beehive because he said if he was going to own a place, he wanted it to be somewhere that he wanted to hang out.
Yeah,
and he liked pinball, so they had one game, and then they opened up the back room.
Yeah,
and they added 7.
That's where I remember the back rooms.
Right. And then they opened King's Court and they had a special room made for pinball. Like an architect came in and like soundproofed it and all of these sort of things.
Wow.
And then Scott got a partner and they created a pinball league, and they started doing tournaments. And there was the Broadway Arcade in New York, which had like the national pinball championships. The guy was retiring. Scott and this other guy bought the league off of them.
No shit.
Brought it to Pittsburgh, moved it first to Carnegie, where they had a couple of 100 games, I think. And it became this huge deal where people were coming from all over the country to play pinball. There was a flood in Carnegie that flooded the place. So they got insurance money. They bought a whole bunch more games. And then they started having these tournaments at the convention center. And
what were they called?
I can't remember the name of the league.
Well, did it go on for a long time?
It did. And so, but these tournaments became so popular that they were the third largest convention in the convention center.
Wow.
It was the car show, the home show, and these pinball tournament games.
That's crazy.
So, so in some ways, I mean, Chicago was the birth of pinball, so it probably was always going to be bigger there.
Yeah, but that's cool to hear, though.
Yeah, I mean, here, I really think in the Northeast, Steve and some of his partners really were responsible for keeping it alive.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
I would have never known that. I saw that there's been some crazy resurgence, and you got all these places now that are like pinball places that got everything. And I swear that there's like a league type of thing that I've seen posted.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Now your tenure at the Beehive, you said from 91 to 96 was like the sweet time of that. Where does that sweet time kind of sour a little bit?
Yeah, I think that, so I want to be clear and say, I think that there were also, as much as I would consider the Beehive to have been my place.
Yeah.
I don't know that I made a difference at the Beehive, right? Like there were groups of people who hung out there every day, right?
Yeah.
Renting apartments 2 doors down from it and having huge parties, and all of that. And because I went to Point Park and lived on Mount Washington, I was one step removed, even though we were there probably 4 or 5 times a week, right?
Yeah.
And it was important to us, right? But I don't know that, if you were to ask people, was Dave Rullo a regular at the Beehive? I'm not sure they would have known who I was because we came and hung out with each, ourselves, and we didn't need to go to, one of their homes because we had a place in Mount Washington where we were throwing parties with 200 people showing up, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, so when we're talking about when the sweet spot changes, when it becomes something else, I think that a lot of things led up to that. First of all, most of the people that started going there in 91 were starting to get gainful employment, right? You can't be out all night when you have some job you need to be at, right? And I know that. So for me, when I started it in 96 at KQV, I started at 7:00 in the morning. Right?
Yeah.
It was becoming increasingly difficult to stay out till 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning and then show up at a job at 7 a.m. Right?
Very interesting point.
Yeah. But I also think that as more things got introduced, so the original concept of the Beehive, which was you were going in there and talking to people, you were cross-pollinating ideas. You were going there and you would be sitting next to somebody at the table next to you who was maybe talking about some art project, and you'd be like, oh, that's cool. Maybe I could do some sound with that, right? Or maybe my buddy does video, or, and so you were doing these different ideas. As we get closer to 97, 98, whatever it was, 2000, the internet starts to come about. People are bringing computers into the Beehive now. They're selling internet service because, not everyone has it in their home at this point.
Yeah.
But so they're coming there and using the computers to access the internet. So they're not talking anymore.
Holy shit. That's so crazy to think about.
That's exactly what happened though. And then you go a few more years and all of a sudden everyone's got a cell phone and nobody's talking, right? And the community itself was changing. The Southside, which in the beginning had very cheap rent and crappy kinds of places where anybody could do whatever they wanted, all of a sudden those places were being bought by out-of-town landlords. They were converting them into very expensive homes, that all of a sudden houses are costing $200,000, $300,000, $400,000. They are changing the type of business that was there. So before, Scott and Steve owned the Beehive, they were right there, right? But now all of a sudden you were having some club where maybe the guy is not a town landlord. You know what I mean? Or there was no more like local hardware stores there anymore.
Yeah.
No more local restaurants, right? These were chains that were moving.
It was starting to get removed from the community.
Yeah. In fact, I know somebody who had a boutique in the Southside on East Carson Street and moved, believe it or not, at the time to Lawrenceville because they couldn't afford the rent on East Carson Street anymore. And that's when Lawrenceville was still fairly rough. And they've just recently, I mean, maybe the last 5 years or so, moved from Lawrenceville to Sharpsburg because they can't afford the rent in Lawrenceville anymore.
Yeah.
So you see how these neighborhoods change, right? So that happened as well, I think. And all of a sudden it just wasn't sort of the viable place for, like you were saying 16, right? You're hitching there, right? Well, when you start getting into 2020 and the kids aren't doing that to the South Side anymore, right?
Absolutely not.
And in some ways,
well, it's so interesting because I now that you say that, the exact reason is because of the phones and like the connection of all the time. Because like I said, I'm 33 and I feel like I was the last generation to get through high school without having a cell phone. Right. I didn't get a cell phone until I was 17. So granted, we had AIM and MySpace and shit like that, but we didn't have a constant connection that we had to everyone.
Right.
But now there's social media, whereas, you always could see what other people are doing. So like, you don't have to go out of your way to communicate with people, in real time. You're just connected to them. You have a piece of string connected to the people that are in your circle. Whereas back then, if you wanted to keep connection with these people, you had to have an excuse to go and, like you said, cross-pollinate with people. I love that terminology that you use for that because, back then that's where, before I had phones, you would link up with someone who had a way to get somewhere, and we'd all just hang out together at that place, whether it be the mall or whether it be the Beehive. We spent a lot of time at like Century 3, but, we would go there and you would spend your time and you would talk to other people that were your age and everything like that. But then now, like you're saying, no one's doing that. If they have a cell phone, people are playing video games online and they could be connected like that.
Right.
It really is crazy to think about that.
Yeah. Everything was analog, even the art we were creating, right? Like, so if we were recording in 96, 97, it was on tape.
Yeah.
So you had to be somewhere where that machine was, now you can download to your phone an app, right? If you were painting,
I'm glad that I got to experience a little bit of the end of it because, I don't know. It's wild to think that all of that could have changed the whole community of the feeling of that, which it really does make a lot of sense. So when you start moving away from the Beehive, when does the Beehive close?
It closed in 2019, January of 2019. They announced they were closing in October of 2018.
Was it that recent?
It was.
I don't know the last time I went. I don't know the last time. Probably had to be around 2015.
Yeah.
But I ended up just not spending a lot of time in Southside.
Right.
That's kind of what changed. Where does, where does your life kind of trajectory go after you start to move away from being like an everyday patron of the Beehive? Like, are you still spending time in Southside at different places or?
No. I was, so I'm working downtown, right? Like I was production director of KQV. And so I'm working downtown and I am much more downtown centric.
Yeah.
But I'm also, some of the ancillary neighborhoods around. So Squirrel Hill and
this is like 2000.
Yeah.
Around there.
Yeah.
Well, let me ask you one question about the Beehive before that. Like while you were going there, how old are you? Like how you said 2000. So what, you were 27 then?
No, I was 18 in 1990.
Okay.
And so, by 96, I'm 24, 25.
Yeah. Okay.
Right?
So 24, 25. So the crowd of you being there while you're in your like early 20s, what other type of crowd was there? Was it a lot of younger people or was there older people or was it like a good mix of everyone?
So I think that the rainbow was tilted on both sides. And so what do I mean by that is there were people my age.
Yeah.
18 to 28, right? Like maybe that was the age. And then there were guys at the Beehive who were like in their 80s.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. Like, because you were saying, the reason that I even asked that is because you were saying that before all this started happening and people moving in, it was an old town.
That's right.
So I didn't know if there was old people that were, kind of, coming along with the times and like going to patronize this business and like kind of going along with it. Like, was it accepted? Like, I'm sure there was a lot of weird people there, and Southside was probably like kind of taken aback almost with the crowd of people. But like you said, once they realize that they're good people, that's fine. But I didn't know if you were going to have like these 80-year-old guys in there, like, just getting their coffee and hanging out.
You definitely did. There's a guy named Chuck, who was a musician who played in a bunch of blues bands and a whole bunch of other bands. He was one of the regulars there. There's a guy named Lloyd Wilson, who is an artist who was originally, I think he still maybe has lofts at the Brew House space. And he has work in the permanent exhibit at the Carnegie.
That's so cool.
So, but these guys were seen as like mentors, right?
Yeah.
By the younger generation. And they were, you start getting into a William Burroughs kind of feel, right? Like these guys were just slightly left of center for regular society, right? I mean,
but to the misled youth, they're like, everything about it. They're not they're not the mainstream.
That's right.
You want to find the person that's the coolest of the weird ones.
That's right. That's a great way to put it.
I mean, it makes sense though. It does make sense. It's cool to hear about like the mingling with everyone and how that all kind of all blends together, because I don't know, like obviously stuff back then wasn't as accepted now. Like back then it wasn't as progressive. Like, was that like a place where you would find like, the LGBTQ community? Like, was that an accepted place?
Yeah, it was. And that's the other thing that made it so interesting, right? It was completely accepting, not just LGBTQ. The Black community, if they wanted to come in, came in, right? Women were a very important part of the Beehive, whether they were baristas or when Scott and Steve wired the place for the internet, it was a woman who, I mean, if you think about it in like 96, 97, this is an unusual thing to hire a woman.
To do this tech
person, right?
Yeah.
In fact, she told me a story that she went to another place on the South Side. They had contacted Steve and said, "Hey, we want to put in some like wireless, like the things you pay, like the handheld devices."
Yeah, and when a woman shows up, they're like, "Whoa!"
And that's exactly what happened. The guy pulled Steve aside and was like, "I don't know if I want a woman working on this stuff."
Wow.
And so they were completely progressive. There were trans people that hung out there and cut hair. There's a woman who was one of the early baristas who tells a story about late one night, some Nazi comes in off his motorcycle and he's got a swastika painted on his helmet. And she was like, "Get the hell out of here." right? Like that was the one thing that wasn't allowed there, right?
Yeah.
Because the community itself was so accepting and so
protecting.
Yeah, and diverse that she knew that something like that would really upset the balance of what was happening.
Yeah, cause chaos between it all.
Yeah.
So it's like you want to be, that makes a lot of sense. That's so interesting. It's so weird for me to think about it because in the time that I spent there, you think like 16 through 18, 19, it's not really like in the foresight of your mind to, you're witnessing, some pivotal place that's going to go down in the museum.
That's right.
It's just a weird coffee shop that is cool and unique. But it's cool. It's so cool to hear about the whole story of it now. And I don't know. So it's interesting also to me that you're saying that there not too many other like landmark, like pillar places in Southside back in this time in the 90s.
There were not, especially for this generation.
Yeah.
There were not. This started it in the Southside.
That's so wild. Yeah. And then it just picks up from there. So, I mean, what are like some other hangouts that you were talking about after you moved out of Southside and you kind of went Squirrel Hill, places like that? Was there any other places that kind of like scratch this itch?
So the Upstage was a place that we frequented.
I've never even heard about that.
Oh, no.
The Upstage.
Yeah. So that was in Oakland and it was... It was a dance club, but it was industrial dance. And they had things like fetish nights and it was really, really alternative.
Yeah.
But the other thing it was really, really cheap.
Yeah.
And so like we had this, I'll tell you that a friend of mine was going through a divorce at one point. Right. And so he wanted to drink as much alcohol every single night as possible.
For as little as much money.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so we would start at the Beehive, which didn't serve alcohol, but we would get
Fuel
some
up.
coffee. And then we would go to, there was this horrible singles club at Parkway Center Mall that we would go and they had $1 mixed drinks from 10 to midnight.
Wow.
So we would go there not to hook up with other people, but to drink as many mixed drinks as we could, right? They had a drink called Red Death. And I don't know what it was, but it tasted like Kool-Aid. And so we would drink a lot of those. And then as soon as midnight hit, it was like we turned into pumpkins and we're gone, right? And we would go to the Upstage because the Upstage had quarter drafts. And so we would drink quarter drafts from midnight to 2. And then we would leave and go back to the Beehive because it was open 24 hours, right?
Wow.
Yeah.
So it was like, you could start your night there and then come back for a nightcap and, regroup.
That's right. It was exhausting though.
I know, but that's so cool. I wish that, it's often talked about on like Reddit, everything like that. Yeah. It's like, where the fuck did all the 24-hour diners or any places go? Another place that we would go to was like, we would just hang out at Denny's.
Sure.
Denny's on 51 was like a place that we would go every weekend and sit there for 3 hours and just bullshit.
Right.
But I don't know. There's really not a place like that now. Is there? Is there a 24-hour coffee shop?
No. In fact, I complain about it every weekend, right? Because most coffee places close at 8:00 now.
And they open at 9 a.m.
That's right.
I'm up at 5:30. I want coffee at 6 a.m.
That's right.
Oh my God.
And it's, the other thing, the Beehive, a lot of the people at the Beehive, maybe at one point were damaged, right? And so they didn't want to go into a bar because some of them were recovering alcoholics, right? And so they wanted a place where they could go and just have coffee.
Yeah.
And that doesn't exist anymore. After 8 p.m., the only places to go now are bars. Even Eaton Park closes at like, I don't know what it is, midnight or whatever.
Yeah, there isn't shit that's open 24 hours anymore.
Right.
I would be surprised if Denny's was still open 24 hours.
I guarantee you it's not.
But that's, I mean, why do you think that is?
I don't know. I mean, I guess COVID changed the way that these businesses think about, maybe people are so happy just to have a place to go. They don't care.
Yeah.
But it doesn't suit my needs.
Yeah.
I mean, I get pissed off every weekend when I go out with some buddies of mine and we've had dinner and it's 7:30 and like everywhere we look at to go is closing in 30 minutes.
Yeah.
Like, I don't understand how places do business like that.
Yeah, it's wild. It definitely is. The whole model got flipped up
Yeah.
up on their head. So, I mean, in this time, let's say early 2000s, you're moving along, going to all these different places. You know, where does your career end up taking you? Like, are you still actively like writing? You're writing. I mean, you said you wrote short stories, you wrote poems. Like, did you ever write any novels or anything like that?
I never wrote a novel. But what happened was when the Beehive was closing, when they announced in October of 2018 that they were closing,
Yeah.
I started to go back there with the same group of guys I originally went there with.
Yeah.
And so while I was sitting there, I thought,
You didn't go there at all before that? Like in the years before?
not really. I mean, we might have stopped in occasionally.
Yeah, but not like anything.
Right.
Okay.
This was pretty hardcore again. Like, hey, our place is closing. Let's.
Why did they end up, without getting too
Yeah.
into it, because I would like to have them on to hear a little bit more about it. Why did they end up closing?
The building got bought by another landlord that was going to raise their rent. And
Yeah.
so they owned the Double Wide and the Tiki Lounge and
Who's they?
Scott and Steve.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And so they just decided that it wasn't worth it, that the last few years had been a struggle with the Beehive.
Yeah.
And they weren't going to make enough money with the rent. So they
Like you said, kids aren't going to go down there and just be hanging out in a coffee
That's
shop
right.
like that.
That's right.
Everyone got a laptop attached to their hands.
That's right. And at that point, every other neighborhood had coffee houses.
good coffee shop.
And it wasn't like it was. People weren't loyal to the Beehive anymore.
Yeah.
Right? These people, people are going in now. Most people go in, they grab a drink. If they sit down to do a little bit of work, they're there for an hour and then they're gone. Right? It's not like it was
All day you're
at the
hanging out
Beehive,
there.
right? And so I thought to myself, there's a story here. And originally I thought it was going to be a novel. I thought I'll just set something in like a coffee house.
Yeah.
And then I thought that's crazy. This place has its own narrative, right? And the people that were here, they all have their own stories, and those stories are worth preserving and telling. You know? I mean,
well, how do you approach this book? You said it's worth telling.
Yeah.
You know, like how do you approach what I'm holding into my hand? Like what was your idea of what it was to what it is now?
Yeah, so I knew pretty quickly that what I was going to do was interview as many people as possible, right? And that there were a handful of key people who really made the Beehive what it was, and then other people who gravitated around them, right? So Fat Man D, I don't know if you know who Fat Man D is.
I know who that is.
Right? But so Fat Man D, at 14 years old, started going to the Oakland Beehive, and then she started working at the Southside Beehive. She was a janitor there. And then she started doing performances there, and she started creating events there. So like they did ramen noodle wrestling, right, in a pool at the Beehive, right? And so, but so she's one of the tent poles, and then there's all these people who were like, "Oh, I love Mandy." You know what I mean? They're going to go and do whatever Mandy's doing, they want to be a part of. Right?
Yeah.
And there were other people like that in this book. Rusted Root, right? Like there was a whole bunch of people who
are all the original people. Like I know Liz Berlin was in there,
Yeah.
but like are all the original people still in that band?
No, I don't think any of them are in the band.
Was she
anymore.
originally in there?
She was originally in it. Yes.
She was one of the original ones.
Yes.
When did they even come out? Early 90s?
So it had to have been 92, 93.
That's so as you're interviewing these people, like let me ask, like whenever you approach like did you just decide I'm going to write a book, and did you know that the Beehive was going to be a focus of this book?
Yeah, so once I started going back to the Beehive, I decided this was going to be the subject.
Okay, yeah.
And
Because it says because it's called Gen X Pittsburgh, the Beehive,
Yeah.
and the 90s
So
scene.
I'll tell you what happened with that. I originally was going to call the book "The Beehive: A Caffeinated Look Back," and my publisher had said to me when I signed the contract with my publisher, they said, "You can suggest, but don't fall in love with the title, because we're going to ultimately pick the title, and we're going to pick the title that we feel is going to sell the book the best."
Yeah, and the 90s scene adds into it.
Yes,
It's like
and-
it encompasses a big thing.
That's right. And when what originally happened was I worked this book a little backwards maybe than most people write a book. That's, they find a subject, they do some interviews, they start to write, they take the first 3 chapters and they go out and they find a publisher.
Yeah.
While I was talking to Scott and Steve about the idea, I was also calling publishers, and there were 2 that I spoke with. And
That's how you approach something like this?
This is not how you're supposed to do it.
Because you're supposed to write it and then approach with the piece.
At least part of it,
Yeah,
right? Right.
So you approach these people with just an idea.
With just an idea.
Okay,
and
hopes and dreams. I love it.
That's right. And what the company that ultimately picked it up said, we love this idea. We think there's a market for like Gen X, right? Nostalgia. But what we want, would you be willing to not just write about the Beehive, but open it up just a little bit and talk about some of the other places that were around at the same time as the Beehive?
Is this publisher like local to Pittsburgh?
No, Arcadia Publishing is a national publication or national publisher, but they do regional titles that they sell nationally. So they do like Pittsburgh Jazz, or they do like Chicago Blues.
Well, that's why I was going to ask, like, what makes them want to do a project like this?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, they think they can, they would sell enough, and it certainly has been selling amazingly.
Well, I see you got people waiting for the library and everything. It's awesome to see the success of it.
It's been amazing. So they were right, and they were right about the title too. It's a title that obviously people are hungry for, or looking for.
Well, I feel like even in like the way that my mind works as like a younger person, like, just the 90s, like, you type that in and it pops up, and, Beehive, A Caffeinated Look Back is a great title and it's romantic. But it's kind of like blunt.
Right. That's right.
It gets to the point.
That's right.
It kind of outlines what it really is to some extent. So, I mean, like the Beehive was a main focus point of what you were doing. And then the 90s scene, like how do you encompass what you're going to ultimately, hone in on? Cause it's a kind of a broad term, right?
Yeah. So, because of my day job, as a reporter, I'm pretty good at saying, I'm writing a story. Here's the beginning, here's the middle, and here's the end. Right?
Yeah.
And so that's how I approached this book was, I knew that I wanted to have an overall narrative, but I wanted these individual chapters that were all going to tie together. And so originally, before I talked to the publisher, before they had asked me to expand it, I started thinking, all right, the book's going to be about like the artists, the musicians. It's going to be about the customers. It's going to be about the history, how they found the building, all those sort of things, right? And then when they asked me to expand it, I started thinking, okay, so I'll do these sort of little sub chapters, right? And so one of them was about Blue Duck Records, which was a big record label in Pittsburgh. It was Rusted Root's first label, right? And so I thought, well, that sort of has a connection to the Beehive, right? Rusted Root goes to the Beehive. They're signed to Blue Duck.
Yeah,
I know the guy that had owned Blue Duck, so I could write about that. Another chapter was about Randy and Slacker, right? And not when I was interviewing Randy originally, it was about the Beehive and about him opening up next door to the Beehive. But I asked him, when do you think the 90s ended? And he said, it ended in 1996 when I got busted for selling pipes, right? Yeah. And I thought, boy, that's a great story, right? And he talked about how the Patriot Act, which gave the government like these powers they didn't exist before, to all of a sudden investigate small businesses and things like that, right? Yeah. And so that became part of one of
that's in this book.
Yeah, a little bit of it, yeah. I mean,
I'm mad that I didn't get to read it yet, but I'm excited to read more into this. But that so it kind of built itself.
It did, and I did it very old school. I had 3 big whiteboards, where I had all the names of the people I was interviewing. I
love that.
Over 70 people. And then
how did you approach the interview? Like, how did you approach how you were going to do this? You told these people, I'm writing a book.
So the people came about in probably 3 different ways. The first one was that Scott and Steve gave me some names.
Yeah.
There's a couple of Facebook groups of like, our Beehive memories and things like that. So I put up posts saying, hey, I'm writing this book. Would love to interview you if you're available. And people contacted me that way. And then they would say, well,
there's this person too.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Okay.
And so then I start to, every person is much more than like the one thing that they get remembered for, right? But you sort of have to, when you're writing a book, you just sort of have to put people in categories.
You're a prospector and you got to find those gems, sort them out.
That's right. So every person gets put in, if you were a musician, you're in you're in the musician chapter, right? If you're if you were primarily at the Oakland Beehive, you're in the Oakland Beehive chapter, right? Some people were just customers, and so they got put in. What I didn't want to have happen, the hardest part was there would be people that would approach me that would say, I want to be in the book. And I'd say, okay, great. What do you do? What did you do there? And they'd say, well, I would come in and drink coffee every day. And unfortunately, at some point, those people weren't necessarily in the book because...
Yeah, I mean, how big can you make the book?
That's right.
Well, how do you approach that as far as like the publisher? Is there a page limit?
There was a word count.
Oh, okay.
They said you can have up to 50,000 words, but no more.
Oh my goodness.
And there had to be over 100 photos. And so that's what it is.
How many words?
There's like 47,839 or something like that.
Was that difficult for you?
No, I mean, I write between 3,000 and 5,000 words a week anyways with my job.
I meant, is it difficult to limit what you're writing? Because I feel like it's so much. Like it would be hard for me. My biggest thing, even if I'm writing posts, my wife always says, cut out all the fluff. Like you're putting too much bullshit in it.
Right.
And I am someone that's like, well, it sounds romantic. It sounds great. It has some seasoning on it. But ultimately, not everyone has an attention span. Right.
Well, so what you'll find is that I'm a very specific kind of writer because of what I do for a living.
Yeah.
Right? So there aren't a lot of adjectives or adverbs. There's the writing, at least I try to make it concise, right?
Yeah.
It's this person did this to whom, right? Like that's a sentence. And,
Yeah.
It, right. Once I was focused on what the chapters were going to be, and I came up with that outline before I even started writing, I assigned each chapter a word count and just tried to stay focused on that. Yeah.
As close as you can.
Right.
And then figure out what pieces you could pull out and put in.
That's right.
And how to make it all fit.
Right. And what I did was, if let's just say the chapter on artists, I anticipated was going to be 3,000 words, but it was 4,500 words. Then I found 1,500 words somewhere else to cut.
Oh, that's interesting. So, I mean, at what point, what date did you start this, and what date did you get the book in your hand?
It was September of 2019.
Okay.
That I started right now. No, it took 2 years to write the book. So September of 22, I guess. Yeah, because COVID sort of put a pause in everything.
Yeah.
It was the tail end of COVID, I guess, that I finally started being, because in 2020 or 2022, I guess, we don't think about it, but things were still, not everything was open all the time. Not everyone was feeling great about like doing interviews and things like that.
Yeah. Being in, same room with people.
Right. But it took, it took me a year. It took me a year and a half to 2 years. It was September of 2022 that I first contacted Scott. And then I interviewed over 70 people, some of them multiple times. The writing part for me was the easiest part. Like, this is what I do for a living. So this is just...
You're not someone that like deals with like writer's block, shit like that?
I'm really not.
Okay.
I just, this is my job, so I sit down and do it.
Yeah,
right?
You turn it on when you need to, turn it off.
I mean, that doesn't mean that I don't read something back I wrote and go, oh, that was crap. Like that needs to be revised.
Yeah.
But for the most part, I'm pretty comfortable with being able to
execute.
The hardest part was getting all the interviews and shutting them off. There were so many times where I would be ready to start to write, and Steve would say to me, oh yeah, by the way, there's one more guy you absolutely have to talk to, right? And the people that they're mentioning, so Al Gore's official photographer hung out at the Beehive when she lived in Pittsburgh. And so you don't say no to interviewing Al Gore's official photographer.
Absolutely. You got to interview Al Gore's photographer.
Right. And there were a lot of people like that.
Yeah.
And
where it just has to it has to be.
Yeah. And so that's what slowed me down getting this book done.
How long were you interviewing people?
You mean each individual? No, a year and a half.
A year and a half to interview people. Yeah. Now, while you were interviewing people, like, did you have an idea of what you were going to ask them?
Kind of. I mean, so if I knew who you were and I knew...
You had points that you wanted to get to.
Yeah. So for instance, like Rick Bach was, he's an artist, but he was one of two people who did all of the graphic design work for the Beehive. And so I knew what I was going to ask him about, right? But he was also in punk rock bands.
Yeah.
And he was one of the people who lived in the apartments down the street from the Beehive that were called Hellrose Place, that like a bunch of the people lived in, right?
Wow.
And so those were like the three things I was going to ask him about. Sometimes, though, it was just, I knew the opening question, which was, so you hung out at the Beehive, tell me about that, right?
Yeah, and that's the best thing because you just let them go wherever they go.
Right. And so, but 99% of the time, somebody would say to me, this person did blank, right? And so then I would say, okay, well, so they were a musician who went on tour with X, and so I can ask them about this thing, right?
Yeah.
Or they were the projectionist at the Oakland Beehive.
Yeah,
right?
so there was a reason to do it, and that like cultivated curiosity as it unfolded.
Right. That's right, and hopefully that's what the readers will find interesting as well.
Well, it's interesting as an interviewer, like I would call myself someone who's pretty well versed after doing it for a while, and it's always interesting. People always ask me like, how do you approach like these random people you're talking to, and I really don't have any sort of look. I have no notebook that I'm asking you shit. I look through people's Instagram, and I have an idea mainly of a couple things that I wanted to touch on, but it really writes itself.
Right.
Because everyone, like you said, everyone has such a fascinating story. It's like, the next person that I have in here is going to have a crazy story. The person after that, crazy, my story to other people, crazy. And that's what's so fascinating about all these people, and being able to do a project like this and be able to like, have a reason and a goal and a finish line. I feel like that's almost like a blessing that you did this in a reverse order.
Right.
Because, ultimately I feel like you could work on this forever.
Yeah, I definitely could have. It helps when the publisher tells you have to have it done by blank.
Get your ass in gear.
Right. And, in terms of the interviews, what I have found the hardest lesson for me to learn as an interviewer.
Let them talk.
Was to shut up. Right. I mean, I've
been doing this
question and
actively 6 years for a long time.
Yeah.
It's the hardest thing in the world because I get so excited.
Right.
And my wife will be like, she listens every episode. She'll hit me up and she'll be like, you're fucking talking over these people. This was going to be a good point and you interrupt it. And it's the hardest thing to do as an interviewer.
Yeah. And I struggle with it in my, my day job too, right? Like this is what I do. I interview people all day, and they'll say something that's so interesting that I want to respond to. And I forget that my job is to pull their information, right? They don't care.
I'm talking about it I'm literally, as you're talking in my mind, I'm like, just shut up,
right.
shut up. I'm literally saying it in my mind because it's so hard for me to do because I don't know. It's not necessarily like, it's not like a one up type of feeling. It's to add, I'm just trying to add to it and expand on it.
That's right. And I think that psychologically we want to be inclusive,
participatory.
Right? So that's right. You tell me something and I want to say, I did that too.
Because that's a way of showing I understand you on this level.
That's right. And so it really is a skill that it takes a long time to learn.
Oh my God. I think about it all the time. Yeah. It's so difficult, but it's really great. I can't wait to, read it. And, so where does all the imagery come from? You said you have to have 100 images in here.
Right.
I mean, how many did you have in the beginning and how do you thin out the 100?
Yeah. So the easy part was Scott and Steve, for whatever reason, saved everything.
Really?
And not only did they save everything, they documented everything. So they took all kinds of photos, and they have books and books of photos in their archive, right? A lot of their stuff, by the way, is in the History Center.
I got to go check it out.
Yeah. So it was, when I was looking for photos, first of all, I put something up on Facebook and got all kinds of stuff. But Scott and Steve just had so much from it that I didn't even have to work hard.
Oh, that's good.
I literally spent 4 hours pulling up the photos, from their stuff.
Yeah.
And like going, oh, wow, they have this sign, right? Like I need to scan this sign and put it. But other people will tell you, like when they do these sort of historical books, they struggle, right? They're calling the Post-Gazette and they're trying to find historical images, or they're going to the libraries. I didn't have to do any of that. Every one of these photos was from the source. So that made it so much easier.
Yeah, and that's so much better for the story.
Right,
That's
right.
really cool.
Yeah.
So I mean, to you get it to you like designing it and like getting this printed out, like how much are you involved with, the detail of that?
Yeah, not much. My wife is a graphic designer.
Okay.
And we had a very specific look we wanted for the book. We were worried the publisher wasn't going to be able to pull it off. But if you look, it looks like a zine
Like
from the time, right?
Almost like a coffee table book,
Right.
something like that.
And they put it together. Like they did that.
Looks
and
great.
It looks great.
It really does look great. You're happy with how everything, was there any point in this journey that you felt that you were losing like creative control of it?
The only question I ever had was when we started going back and forth with titles, right?
Yeah.
And this was like 3/4 of the way through, where they're like, well, we're thinking Gen X Pittsburgh, the Beehive, the 90's scene. And I was like, boy, that doesn't feel great to me, right? Like that feels so long and just so laborious, right? Like who's going to type that in? And they're like, you got to trust us, right?
Yeah.
And I'm like, no, I don't. No. Like,
Are you a control freak?
I don't think I am, but I probably am.
Yeah. Well, I feel like that this is like, any artist's piece, like, no one is going to care about it as much as you. No one's going to understand it on the level you do.
That, so I have a friend, his name's Abby Mendelson. He's a fairly famous writer in Pittsburgh. He probably has 20 or 30 books published. And when I first brought up the idea of a book to him, he said, look, here's the deal. One, publishers are dead, right? Like it's impossible to find publishers anymore. You might have to struggle to find one. But the other thing is this has to be a passion project for you, right?
Yeah.
You can't write it if you don't love it, right? So if this isn't something you can live with for 2 years, don't do this project, right? and that was good advice. It was passion. I was passionate about the Beehive anyways. So that was fairly simple for me.
Yeah, like a root of it.
Yeah.
Driving force.
Right.
Now, was the process, was this like what you were talking about? Were you obsessed for 2 years? All you're thinking about, all you're breathing, eating, everything, every waking moment? I know you said you have a wife and a son. You got a family, you got to balance that.
Right. Not as much as you would think. I'm pretty good at compartmentalizing.
That's
things,
good.
Right. And so I'm able to go, Monday through Friday from 8 a.m. to 4 o'clock. I'm
grinding,
interviewing people, and I'm writing stories for the Chronicle, right? But at 5 o'clock, I'm grabbing my bag and I'm going to some coffee house to interview somebody, right? And then on Sundays, I'm getting together with a couple of my other friends, and we have a band, right? And so I'm doing that. And while I'm playing in the band, I'm not thinking about the Beehive book, right? But in the shower, I was thinking about it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And in the car, as I'm driving down the road, I'm thinking about it.
Huh. Well, it's like, it seems to be, I don't know. It seems to be a pretty incredible like journey to get to where it is.
It definitely is an incredible journey. And it's weird now that this part of the journey is completed, right? Because I feel like there's more to do. There's promoting the book. It's already sold amazingly well, but I feel like it needs to sell better.
Yeah.
And so I'm trying to do that. And then I'm looking for vertical opportunities with the book. So,
what does that mean?
So I think that this book would make a great fictional 6-part series on like Netflix.
Oh, okay.
And so I'm trying to find ways
that
to
would
do
be
that,
cool.
right? Like, not a documentary.
No, but like a
regular TV show, right?
Yeah.
6 parts and in and out, and that's the end of it. And so I'm trying to do that. I'm trying
That's cool.
to pitch other ideas. You know what I mean?
Well, let me ask you about how you approach, selling. So you have this book. How many copies do you get made?
I don't know how many. The publisher hasn't told me. I asked him that question, and he said he was going to get back to me, and I haven't heard back yet.
So I guess it's a moot point anyway. But like, is it your job to sell the book?
So it's the publishing company has salespeople and they have publicists.
Yeah.
And they're all doing their work.
Yeah.
I am also meddling more than I should, right? Because I'm saying, hey, I know that there's this podcast in Pittsburgh, right? Like I need to be on this. You need to do this for me because they're in Chicago, right?
Yeah.
I'm saying,
Like, are
are
you going to the
publishers-
bookstores here and like, beating on the door there and like,
So almost every bookstore has this. And I went around to all of the independent stores and signed all the copies they have. I went to all the Barnes and Noble and signed their copies. I've been to the distribution by this company is really, really deep.
Yeah.
So they're at Giant Eagles, right? And so I've been going.
This book is?
Yeah. Well, the publisher is.
Yeah.
And so like I'm going to the Giant Eagle, and if the book isn't there, I'm calling up this publisher and going,
is this
"You
the
need to
same
get this."
publisher that does all the historical books?
is.
Okay. Yeah. Because they always have, I always see that in Giant Eagle. They have
That's
them racks.
That's right. So I'm calling them up and going, I was just at the Giant Eagle in Mount Lebanon and this isn't there. You need to get this in there, right? And now's the time because now's the publicity. So I need you to be out there getting this book in there.
Yeah.
And they're like, okay, Dave, we know what our job is.
Yeah.
Right? You're like, well, I promise.
You're like, all right, yeah. But are you also like, are you going to like the local bookstores and saying like, hey, I'm the writer. Is that how you would approach it if you had a book? Or do you, since you went through a publisher, do you have to be like, oh, I have a publisher, hit them up to do this?
I went to, so the publishers told me we have relationships with most of the independent bookstores. Right?
Okay, yeah.
But there were some that they didn't have or maybe hadn't thought of would be the right fit, but I knew because I'm here
Yeah.
that they would be.
Yeah.
And so I went out of my way to make sure to call them.
Yeah.
And to say, you're going to get a phone call from the publishing company. I hope you bring it in.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the other thing is that in terms of promoting the book, first of all, I'll say that I'm lucky because most of like the editors and producers and things like that who are running the shows are like my age. So
Yeah.
they're familiar with the Beehive, right? But I've had to do a little bit of educating to some people who are like younger, right? And say, there was this coffee house called the Beehive. It was really cool. Trust me, you're going to want to bring in this book. And they'd be like, well, maybe I'll bring in a copy. And I was like, no. You need to bring in like 20 copies, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we sold out of 80 copies at the publication party in under an hour.
Yeah. That's crazy.
That's insane. That doesn't.
I mean,
happen.
are you able to be like, are you able to go to like some of these independent bookstores and be like, hey, can I do a signing in here?
I am. And that's what's happening now. I just set up one with the Poetry Lounge.
Where's that at?
That is in Millvale. That is
Poetry
a bar.
Lounge.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so it is on it's Monday, December 17th.
Okay.
And so I'm doing some form of reading and signing there. I'm setting up other opportunities now. I'm going to be doing something at Uptown Coffee in Mount Lebanon.
Oh, fantastic coffee. Just had it the other day.
Yeah. And I'll probably be at some other bookstores and I'm trying to set up something with Amazing Books if Eric has time for me to be there. So
yeah. That's cool. Yeah. That's so right now, I mean, like you just got the book in your hand and you're, now the real work is really what's starting to happen. Yeah. And I mean, that's what you got to do from now.
That's it.
That's what you started from here. And now, like, how do you approach like getting your name out there?
I'm just making phone calls,
yeah,
and showing up.
Yeah.
I will say this, the book has been so successful that tomorrow I have a meeting with the publisher about a second book.
That's great.
They have an idea for a subject. I'll find out what it is and we'll go from there.
That's cool.
I mean, I think that I'm not sure how many writers get asked less than a week after their book has been published, to do a second book. So
yeah, I mean, it's obviously doing well.
Yeah, or at least it was until today. I'm not sure if it still is or not. I haven't checked, but it was the bestseller in the coffee and tea category on Amazon.
That's awesome.
And it was I think it was like as high as number 7 in the rock category.
Yeah.
Which is kind of cool because like you'd see like, a Kiss book.
Yeah.
A Pearl Jam
this is
book.
like rock adjacent.
Yeah. And then my book and then like a Bruce Springsteen book. And it's just like outrageous to see this sort of thing. So,
well, I mean, it's cool to be able to kind of, it's probably like therapy for you going back and reliving a lot of the memories that you had.
Yeah, it definitely is.
What are your goals, with this? I mean, you just got it. Obviously you want to get as many copies sold and you want to get it out to as many people as you can. But, what are your goals?
Yeah, I mean, so I really have two goals. And the first one, obviously, is to figure out what the next project is, right? And I don't even mean with this publisher. I mean, what's next? Like, how do I make this into a sustainable living, right? With doing books. And
I mean, is this like the first like book that you wrote besides for just like short stories and poetry?
That is correct. Yes.
Wow.
So, but the other thing is, and this is, I mean, legitimate. Scott and Steve were very visionary, right, in what they created. And it really helped to form modern day Pittsburgh. And so part of my goal is to really promote what they did and make sure that people know about that vision, because it's really important. And I don't think they get the credit for it, or haven't so far got the credit that they deserve.
You need to link me up with them.
I definitely will.
I would like to have them both in here to talk about that.
Yeah, I definitely will.
Because I don't know really anything about them, but we talked about it at length about, how pivotal what they did was for the city. And it's definitely something that needs to be talked about more, but that's interesting. And it got to be exciting to like hold this in your hand as someone who is a lifelong writer, and it's got to be exciting to, execute something and see it, be a success rather than a flop, and to know that you got some wind in your sails, and now you could really, what can you do with what you have?
What's been most exciting is that, so whenever you do a book like this, there's always going to be errors, right? You're going to say the name of a club wrong, or put it on the wrong block, or something else, right? So I anticipated that. What I was most worried about is this is a book of people's memories.
Yeah.
And I wanted to make sure I honored those memories, right? And told their story the correct way.
Yeah.
And what's been exciting is that over the last week, I've been hearing from people who have been texting and calling and coming up to me and saying, you really did right by me.
That's good.
You really captured what I was trying to tell you. You really worked, and I can see that on capturing what it felt like to be me at that point of time in my life. And so that's been really special to me.
Yeah, to have that sort of acknowledgement that you did what you wanted to do ultimately.
Yeah.
Man, that's cool.
Yeah.
It got to be a cool feeling to, aside from, it being on the charts and Amazon and shit, to hear from people that really lived it, to know that it was like, it was done right.
Yeah, it's been great. It's been fabulous.
That's amazing. I'm excited to dive into it, and I'm excited to read through it. I'm excited. I'm excited to check out the other work that you did. I like poetry. I like short stories. I'd like to read some of that too.
I tell people don't buy that.
Well, I'm going to read it anyway. But so, I mean, like, do you have any other, do you write any fiction or anything like that?
Because of my job, I haven't been writing too much. I had some piece published last year, I think, in Red Noise Collective. I went to Israel, and I did some poetry based on the trip to Israel that got published, but I haven't done too much else.
Yeah.
Like you said,
you're in one vein.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like you're in one vein. You got to, keep that short sharp.
That's right.
That's great. Do you think that there's anything I missed as far as, us talking about this book? Did you get any blowback at all on the book?
Yeah.
From what?
So, I almost hate saying this, but it's on Facebook, so I don't mind. There was one guy who was a promoter in the city, a music promoter. And, he viewed it as like a competition between like the East End and the South Side, between like music, right? And I called him and asked him if he wanted to be in the book. And he said no. He felt that it wasn't appropriate for him to be in this book because he wasn't really part of the South Side and didn't really like the scene or anything else.
Yeah.
And when I started to get interviewed, he put up, with all these different, so the City Paper and CityCast and your Jagoff and all these things, right? He put up a post on Facebook that said, David Rullo's helped bury like my part, right? And rewritten the narrative so that the South Side is won, which first of all, I don't think anybody wins 30 years later, right? And water rises all boats and all
the hell's the South Side winning right now?
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right. But so he was not happy at all. And some of his friends, rightly so, were supporting him and saying, oh, well, you can't have a Pittsburgh music book that, isn't about, that doesn't include you, but this isn't a Pittsburgh music book. And I want people to know that this touches on a lot of the music that happened on the Southside.
Well, didn't you ask him anyway?
I did. And that's what I said on Facebook. I said, I did ask you.
Yeah. I mean, like if he had,
right. So, but that's been the only real pushback.
Well, that's good.
Yeah. And I all in all, I think even he was protective of his memory. Right. And so in some ways he doesn't want to feel like everything that he did through the 90s has been forgotten.
Yeah. Right. And it's understandable.
That's completely understandable.
But it's also, hey, you got asked.
That's right.
If you ask, you can't say nothing about it.
That's right.
Come on now. You could have said your piece.
That's right. And he can also spend 2 years writing his book too.
Well, it would have been interesting, I don't know, as a journalism, I'm sure that you're the same way. It's like you got to hear both sides of the coin. Like, I'm sure that there's people that didn't like the Beehive. All right. I'm sure that there's people that didn't like Southside. So it's like, if that's part of the story, that was part of the story. And there was an opportunity and it wasn't had, and leave it at that, I guess.
Right. And, I've tried to be specific to people, or I've tried to tell people that this is a specific slice of history.
Yeah.
Right. It also, I could have told stories about like people partying every night on the South Side, right?
Yeah.
From the Beehive, right?
Yeah.
Or I could have talked about some of the other coffee houses and added a more textured image of what the South Side was, right? But that's not what this book is.
Yeah, it's not what it's about.
Right. This book really tried to place the Beehive culturally in the South Side and talk about how that helped the city recover from its post-industrial morass that was happening in the early or late 80s, early 90s.
Add some color to that.
That's right.
That's very good. I'm excited about it. All right.
Glad.
Well,
Thank you.
let's get to the ending segment of the podcast, and then I'll get you out of here back to your family. Okay. The ending segment that I do with everyone is an ending segment called Desert Island Questions.
Okay.
All right, Desert Island Questions. Whenever I give each guest 3 categories to take with them on a desert island and use until they starve to death and die. First category, 3 movies to take with you on a desert island.
Yes,
Pick 3 movies, watch over and over and over again.
I love singles.
Singles.
Yeah, I can watch it every day.
Okay.
I like Casablanca a lot.
Okay.
Probably these are also Gen X, right? But I love Reality Bites. I can watch Reality Bites.
All 3. Those are good choices. Okay, second category, 3 books that you would take to read over and over.
Yeah, books are a lot harder. On the Road by Jack Kerouac would be definite. Probably A Coney Island of the Mind by Lawrence Ferlinghetti. And
what is that?
It's a book of poetry.
Oh, okay.
And then maybe To Have and Have Not by Hemingway, probably.
You read a lot still?
Yeah.
It's and what do you typically read?
So I am the co-leader of a book club for the Pittsburgh Jewish Chronicle. So I read a lot of Jewish literature.
Yeah.
And I also read a lot of biographies.
Yeah.
A lot of biographies. I'm reading one about Lou Reed right now.
Wow.
And I read a lot of music books, and then a lot of, what would be classified as sort of like general fiction.
Yeah. Interesting. I've just been reading fiction. I've just been reading, fucked up horror books.
Yeah.
Things like I'm reading The Shining right now for the first time. Just read Misery. So I don't know. I got to get more into, I got to read some more nonfiction, because there's so much out there. It's as a new reader, I have so much on my read list. It gives me anxiety to like look at some of these books over here. It gives me anxiety to even see them because there's so much I have to go through. Okay. Third category, 3 CDs.
Oh yeah. So probably 9 Inch Nails to Fragile. The Replacements, maybe All Shook Down, and Warrior Soul, Drugs, God, and the New Republic.
I never heard the last one.
Oh, see, you got to listen to Warrior Soul.
What kind of music?
They are political hard rock.
Okay.
From the 90s.
Okay.
Corey Clark was the first 5 or so albums, Drugs, God, New Republic, Dead Last Decade, Dead Century, Ghetto Nation are just.
I'll listen to it.
Just listen to the titles. You know where you are. They're amazing.
I'll listen to it. Okay, third to last question is the death row meal. You about to get put to death. You get a get appetizer, a main course, and a dessert.
Yeah. Appetizer's hard. Definitely like steak. I'm pretty simple, right?
Yeah.
It's steak and chocolate cake. And for an appetizer, I don't even eat appetizers. Something ridiculous like French fries would be fine.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, this is a question that I add in, but what's the best concert you've ever been to?
So Warrior Soul opened for Queensryche. That was a great concert. I saw 9 Inch Nails on the Fragile tour. That was amazing.
Yeah. My buddy's a 9 Inch Nails freak.
Yeah. I saw KMFDM with Ogre, and that was amazing. And then there's a whole other side of me that I saw Roy Hargrove, who's a jazz trumpet player, play in the Village in New York.
You a big jazz guy?
Yeah.
I've just started to dabble in it.
Yeah.
One of the guys that I had on, Kevin Drobish, gave me a Miles Davis record.
Yeah.
And I try to listen to it, and I've probably listened to it 25 times.
Yeah.
And I'm just starting to kind of be able to, in the beginning, it just sounds like a bunch of people playing instruments in a room, not really meshing. But now, after my 25th, 26th, 27th, I'm starting to kind of understand it a little bit, just very little. But anything else, it's just I feel too dumb.
Well, the nice thing about Miles Davis is he had so many different periods. I don't know what he gave.
This is Blue.
Bitches Brew?
No.
Kind of Blue.
Kind of Blue, yeah.
Yeah. So Kind of Blue is really laid back. But if you listen to Bitches Brew, that's the start of fusion jazz. And so it's much more rock.
Yeah.
My Vishnu Orchestra is a great.
You have to give me some recommendations.
Yeah.
Okay, second to last question is: you're getting ready to go on a road trip. You go to a gas station. You go to get a snack. What's your snack of choice?
Absolutely, Reese's Peanut Butter Cups.
Reese's? Yeah. That's the main. Yeah. You're a real salt of the earth guy. Yeah. I like a steak, a chocolate cake, a Reese's peanut butter.
I'm pretty simple.
Yeah, that's all right. That's good. Okay, and last question: if you could have a conversation with anyone alive or dead, who would it be and why?
There's a guy, a Jewish philosopher, more than that, named Maimonides, and I would love to talk to him. His understanding of what we would call metaphysics in the Torah and everything was just so deep that I would love to talk to him. But I would also love to talk to Hemingway about just his writing techniques and how he did it. Those would be the two probably.
Those are good answers.
Yeah.
Is there anyone that you wanted to interview for the book that might have passed or, you weren't able to?
No, I think I was able to figure out everybody, I think.
Yeah. That was one of the people.
Yeah.
That's pretty wild. There was no pivotal people that have left us.
Yeah. Because at some point it was just more about making sure that I was appropriately telling the story of the Beehive. So as long as I felt that there were people that represented all different categories, then I was pretty happy with it.
I love that. Where could, people find the book? How could people get the book? How could people find more about you?
Yeah. So the book's available everywhere. It's on Amazon. It's at White Whale. It's at City of Asylum. It's at, basically every single independent bookstore around town has it. It's at Barnes & Noble. It will hopefully be in every Giant Eagle, every CVS. So you should be able to pick up this book.
Amazon, everywhere. It's on there?
Yeah.
Now, is it on places like Kindle?
It's not on Kindle. They don't have an electronic version of the book.
Okay.
Or a spoken word, an
audiobook.
Right.
There's
not
an
audiobook either.
Okay. Yeah. Just making sure.
Yeah.
And what is, is there, people buy these books and they want you to sign it and stuff like that, how can they find out?
Yeah.
You said you were doing a signing and stuff like that. Where can you find that out at?
Yeah, if you go to my Facebook page, just David Rullo, I'm constantly putting all of that stuff up there, and I'm happy to, meet people on the side of the road.
Yeah. Maybe we should do a giveaway to promote the episode. We'll give away a book.
Yeah, sure. I have to get you one.
Yeah, that'll work. Yeah, that's good. I'll, you know what I'll do? I'll give away this one, and I'll grab another one.
Okay.
Now let me ask you this: as a reader yourself, what's your favorite bookstore in the city? Without playing favorites.
Yeah, I really do like City of Asylum.
City of Asylum.
Yeah,
Where's that at?
That's on the north side.
I gotta interview someone that owns a bookstore.
Yeah, City of Asylum is a little different because it's a not-for-profit that, in addition to having a bookstore that has all kinds of local authors and other just interesting books, it's also a not-for-profit that's dedicated to bringing artists who are in danger where they live into Pittsburgh and giving them, making them a writer in residence so that they're safe. So I really like that bookstore. I really like White Whale.
White Whale's in Bloomfield?
Yeah.
I've been there once.
Caliban is fabulous.
I've never even heard of that.
That's in Oakland.
Someone just told me about a place called Fungus.
Okay. Yeah, I do know that.
I don't know any of these places.
Yeah. Karen's Book Row, which is part of Caliban's, she's an amazing person. And then Eric, who has amazing books, which is in Squirrel Hill, is another fabulous bookstore.
Well, that's good to know. David, I appreciate you taking some time to come over and talk with me.
I love that you had me.
I thought it was fantastic. Great conversation. Had no idea what it could be, but I'm really happy with it. It was as someone who spent time in Southside, it was like, it's enlightening to, just hear from someone else's point of view that really came up in it. And I appreciate it. I hope that more people grab the book and, I hope to see another one. From
your lips to God's ears.
Everyone else that's listening, appreciate it as usual. Each and every week, we're back with another great guest doing great things in the city. Thank you for listening. Call you right back.